Hi, welcome to Last Week in Local for the week ending September 30th. I'm glad to be back. And unlike Mary, I was actually working in my absence and traveling. She was out sort of
Sure.
skiing or who knows, or
You're
kayaking or rafting, hiking. Who
you
knows
were
what
at
she
the
was doing,
lake,
but it
Mike.
wasn't working. What's
We
that?
know. You were at the lake. We know.
Yeah. Oh,
Mike
I
will
have a
back us up.
question to ask you, Mike. Did you buy Dar a kayak yet?
No, but we're close. So we're gonna
Okay.
buy two kayaks instead
Two.
of yeah.
Right.
We just need something we can get down. We have a little river by us. It's actually in the spring flows pretty heavily. Not whitewater, but it's just one more way to get out and enjoy the world around us. So no, we will be buying kayaks. So
All right. I've been
um,
helping her shop, you
I saw
know.
that. Well, it's nice to have a personal recommendation. We'd been looking at portable kayaks, but how do you know which one to buy, right? So
Right.
it was nice to have your recommendation. Um, one, I just wanted to, we had a great local U a couple weeks ago in Denver that Carrie valiantly pulled off almost single-handedly, did all the logistics. But it was a great event, a lot of great speakers, a lot of great content, some of which we'll be referencing today. For those of you who came, thank you very much for joining us. And also, I just want one other piece of housekeeping, that if you're listening to this podcast and you want the links that were referenced, they can be found in a blog post on our blog. And also, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you can get them there. So if you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to this, if you're receiving this email, I don't know what to tell you.
Good work.
Uh,
No homework
so,
for you.
so with that, the Attorney General of Washington filed suit against a number of Washington companies. Mostly it was around robocalling and spoofing phone numbers, but one of them, DLM Service, was charged with violating the Consumer Protection Act by virtue of creating fake Google reviews to misrepresent its reputation. So it's interesting to see that New York isn't the only state in which this is starting to filter down. One of the things I talked about at Local U was how federal enforcement had doubled every 4 years over the last 20, basically, and how it had become more significant, but now we're starting to see this filtering down to state attorney generals, which I think is a good thing. In California, they passed a landmark bill to remake the gig economy, where they're now redefining gig economy workers as employees instead of contractors. Of course, Uber claims they're not affected by this ruling. I can't remember their logic. It was a little twisted. Anyways, so I came up with this new phrase. So Uber is sort of like means a great big dickhead, right? So like, just over the top,
Over the top dickhead.
Ubers. WeWork was in the news last week.
You old man.
Good article at mattstoller.substack.com about WeWork and counterfeit capitalism. And he notes that WeWork is a hilarious example because it's such an obvious example of self-dealing couched in new age management consulting speak. And then today in the news, it was announced that, he was fired last week after he'd cleared out $700 million for his personal thing, after he was found to have many self-dealing deals, like he would own the building and lease it back to WeWork. It's like he's running it like my father ran his business. It's like, anyways, his eccentric behavior, one of the reasons he was fired, they noted that his eccentric behavior further undermined his position. Reports of marijuana smoking on private jets. Okay, that's not so eccentric. I mean, everybody, at least in Colorado, does that. But what
Especially
I thought,
if you have a private jet.
Yeah,
particularly, but his claims that he was working on becoming immortal. Now that did it for me, right? So this puts him in the Uber class along with DoorDash and Uber. So we will not use the word dickhead anymore. We'll just call them Ubers.
Okay.
So
that other Uber was in the news. I don't think we talked about that in the pre-talk, but there was some DoorDash something going on this week too.
Like, I mean, you can only laugh because it's kind of like our presidential situation. If you don't, it's sort of like ready to blow your brains out.
Yes.
Anyway, Wall Street Journal had an exclusive. that Groupon is said to be pursuing acquisition of Yelp as its business faces pressure. It was an interesting article, an interesting thought experiment. What would happen if the two of them merged together? As Andrew Shotland pointed out, certainly Yelp could just start a coupon service and not need to be bought out. And there's a lot of personality involved in the form of Jeremy Stoppelman, and also the fact that Groupon, which was once valued at $16.5 billion in 2011, and I think they turned down was it an $8 billion offer from Google, is now valued at 1.7, but Yelp by comparison is valued at 2.46 billion. So it doesn't seem like I assume it was a trial balloon that Groupon was testing. Who knows if anything will come of it, but I thought it was interesting. We've talked in the past about online accessibility, how there were a growing number of suits in the area, how you needed to be sure that your website at inception and or after the fact was tested against accessibility guidelines. But it turns out that there's never been, even though the courts have ruled that it is critical infrastructure and it is falls under the American with Disability Acts for accessibility, there's never been any clear guidance. So in 2010, the Justice Department said it was going to put out a web accessibility regulations, but it ultimately ditched that plan in 2017. They never did. So, but there have been increasing number of suits, and Domino's, who was sued under this, is taking it to the Supreme Court under the contention that since there's no formal guidance as to what's acceptable and what isn't, that the suit's invalid. We'll see what happens. That being said, I think that it makes sense to have an accessible website. It's not that hard to design for it, and something you should plan in from the beginning. Google Core update last week seems to focus on health sites as well as news sites, although the new flux meter from Bright Local did seem to show a fair bit of change in search results simultaneous with this update, mostly in the services industry, home repair, locksmiths, those sorts of areas. So it did seem to have some impact on local. It's a little hard to pin down to the correlation there. Good article at trafficthinktank.com by Saijo George. Saijo, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, you'll have to forgive me, but you can blame it on Carrie. She always gets them wrong.
I always get them wrong.
I was just trying to deflect my inability to know how it. Anyways, it's a good article for anybody who's doing regular audits. It was like 11 tips to leverage Chrome for more efficiency in things like switching reported location, taking a full-size screenshot of a web page in Chrome, tips and tricks that would make your life with Chrome more efficient. I thought if you're doing a lot of audits, makes sense. And in speaking of audits, this was a tweet by Kate Hempenius obviously on Twitter, where she describes how using webpagetest.org, you can create two side-by-side tests of page load speed between your site and a different site. Again, another, I thought, interesting tool that could be useful in audits for SEOs, where it's very visual, showing that your page loads in 6 seconds while your major competitor loads in 3.
So to me, that is a huge advantage if you can actually show people how they compare to somebody that they consider to be a big competitor of theirs.
Exactly. Yeah, I thought it was a very clever way of upgrading your audits. Mm-hmm. Today at Street Fight, David, Mim, and I had an extensive conversation about Google Maps. The title of the article was The Underappreciated Discovery Channel, but I think the title could have been Google Maps, the new king in town. Well, when I started seeing a couple months ago, because I was doing a case study around a small restaurant, I saw a preponderance of incomings, impressions, etc., like 3/4 of them coming from Google Maps instead of search. So this caused me to take a deeper dive. I looked at several other categories. I noticed something similar where at least over half of them for Barbara Oliver come from maps, not search. I did notice at the time that lawyers, on the other hand, was reversed. More were still coming from search. So I asked David, who presented this information at Local U, to use Thrive High's data set to find out if this transition was very broad or narrow. And 75% of their data set showed had transitioned to more searches occurring in Google Maps than in Google Search. The implications for this are pretty broad. I think that businesses need to be thinking about what kind of business they are. They need to go into their Google Insights and see whether they are a Maps first or a search first business. I think businesses that get searched on during the business day are going to be search first. Businesses that get searched on after business hours or in the car might be Maps first. That's a theory. But also, so I think there's a tactical issue here. The ranking is a little bit different, it seems to me. I haven't quite figured out why, but also there's more infinite scroll, so there's more chance of being seen, even if you're not first, second, or third. The other issue here is that this is more of a walled garden than we've even become used to in search, where there is no third-party reviews, no web references, no links to anything other than Google information and your website. So all of a sudden, it may change Google as your homepage thinking, or at least you have to revise it for this context. So I think it has a lot of implications that I think a lot of people aren't thinking about yet. Comments?
I think, your walled garden comment just makes me think more and more about how Google wants to remove third parties from the whole equation. And they want to control everything like they've done in some verticals, or tried to do in the regular search results in some verticals. And I think by building up Google Maps, they create that environment where they don't have to let third parties in there. It's, there's no stars. It's very captive. So it makes sense to me for them to build that up. And for them to build another outlet to be like that, like you said, that third search engine that is going to
it'll be
all that
Google
volume.
search, YouTube search, and map search.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think from when I look at it and I think about it that way, and I asked my daughter and son about it, what tools do they use? My daughter lived in Brooklyn, New York, where she was always in strange neighborhoods. And she reported back that she exclusively uses Google Maps. She no longer does web search. And she said, why be in Yelp anymore? Why be in browser anymore? If I can do everything I want from subway instructions, bus travel, to finding coffee shops, finding Wi-Fi, finding appliance dealers that in the neighborhood I'm in. In fact, she said even up to and including fast casual restaurants she would do on Google now. Mm-hmm. She wouldn't do a fancy restaurant like when she's spending my money. She would actually look for a critic review, but she wouldn't go back. She wouldn't go back to Yelp anymore. She was Google Maps plus critic reviews for super high-end sort of experience, which I thought was a fascinating tale of a millennial. If Yelp has lost her, they've lost the game, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But, Google Maps, in being the interface of the world, potentially or pretends a time when local search isn't the third leg, it's the first leg that far outstrips regular search in terms of volume and engagement and usability. Again, Google is ready to achieve dominance in yet one more area, or maybe they already have. Right?
Well, if we think about Google as the engine that wants to help you get things done, local search in many cases is more relevant to the searcher than, non-localized results, right? Like if I'm local and I search hot water heater replacement, I don't want a how-to article. I want a company who can help me do it, right? So
exactly.
I think that makes sense that local is becoming, the first leg on the tripod, so to speak. And, we're going to talk about it in a few minutes, but I also think it's interesting to look at what all you can do on maps now versus, 5-10 years ago when Yelp was big. Like you can go in your Maps app, you can find the subway stop, you can find a restaurant, you can find a shoe store, like just by tapping a couple. You don't even have to sometimes type in a query. It just brings it up.
Virtual reality for walking directions. right?
Yeah, the integration of everything in Google Maps is what's making it so attractive to me. The fact that I can look something up and then get directions to it.
Right.
Well, and
Without
they're outstripping their competitors, right? I clicked on something on my iPhone and it opened Apple Maps. I'm not exactly sure why, because I have Google Maps as my default, and I knew instantly this is not my Maps app. This is not what I use. This is not the right stuff. No, goodbye. Like I
Right.
was not in the
Yeah,
right
so
spot.
it gives them a much bigger moat in terms of search for several reasons. One is they own the whole map stack, right? From Street View to all the way up to the best listings. Two, they own Android, and this is the default installation for Android, which is 50% of the United States market. And in Apple, like you, I mean, I'm an Apple Maps fan for several reasons. One is that for driving directions, it's actually become quite good. I actually like the way it tells me to be in the two left lanes, but also I'm concerned about privacy. But certainly at least half, if not more, of Apple users use Maps. So that puts them at somewhere in the order of 75, 80% market penetration for Maps in environments where it's very difficult for others to compete. So it gives them a much bigger moat going forward. And I think, like you've pointed out, the opportunity in local is much bigger than it is to get things done. It's much more relevant and bigger than general search. I think this is, and the fact that we're just noticing it now, it's probably been going on. I think when I went back and looked at Barbara Oliver, it's been happening since 2017. I just happened to, I'm so focused on the 3-pack, is like slap me across the face and wake me up, right? Mm-hmm. You need to start looking at maps, particularly on the phone, as where people are going to be finding you.
Sure.
All right, so Joy published this on Twitter and probably at the local search forum, but Google My Business finally adds a new contact form for restaurants to remove the online ordering buttons. Maybe they, this has been one of the more annoying sort of Google and Grubhub and DoorDash and all those guys sucking businesses from local businesses, or and deceiving local purchasers who don't realize that 30% of your money, including your tip, is going to get misappropriated, right? So it is a move in the right direction. That's assuming they actually respond to the forms and actually take the button off. Who knows? But as you pointed out, it doesn't affect advertising on the knowledge graph, on the business profile, and it doesn't affect the links that are there, but at least it removes that great big call to action if in fact they act on it. And then at Search Engine Land, Joy did a good article, 4 Things to Know About Google Posts in the 3-pack and Local Finder. We're seeing good examples of even very recent or much older posts snippets showing up when they match the search query, showing up in the pack. Joy said that it doesn't seem to impact rank on a term, but it does seem to impact reach. I've done a few experiments on very long tail things where I was able to surface a photo from one post and a quote from a different post on a search for, I think it was gold wedding bands or some very long tail search. And it all showed up. So I think it could expand the reach, if not the rank. So that's, to keep an eye on. And then finally, in terms of Google tactics, good article at localvisibilitysystem.com from Phil Rozek, how to move Google reviews between Google My Business service area business listings. Apparently, when you move from Miami to California, if you were a service area business before and stay a service area business, Google will allow you to move your reviews. Obviously, if you're moving with a business address, they don't. If you're moving any great distance, more than a little bit, they don't allow that. But in a service area business, they do. So, interesting article.
So, what would stop someone from switching their business to service area for, say, a month or two before their moving, establishing their business in the new place as a service area business for a month or two, and then switching to brick and mortar again? Would that work?
The fact that every time you switch Google, it raises flags at Google and dramatically increases the likelihood of suspension.
Okay. I'm just curious. I just can see the people trying to get around it
Yeah,
or
my
whatever.
recommendation is if you're supposed to be a service area business, set it now. If you're
Right.
not, don't front with it, because one way or the other, Google is going to suspend you. And suspensions are very easy to come by these days. So even a change like that can precipitate
Well,
it, creating multiple weeks of work for you to get relisted.
suspension plus backlog plus
Right.
compliance
They've gotten
checks.
better. I mean, the reports in my little cabal of product experts is that they're doing unsuspensions in fewer than 7 days now, but it's like, who needs it, right?
Right.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure the value of trying to save your reviews if you do move like that. One time had a IT guy who established himself in Orange County in California, and then he moved to Texas and wanted to enjoy the same rankings that he got in Orange County, but all his citations showed the old address.
Right.
His reviews were talking about towns in California, not towns in Texas. And it really was a big mess. He probably would have been better off starting all over again with a new website.
Mhm.
You ready for me yet?
Go ahead. It's all yours.
All right. At Sterling Sky, Joy asked and answered the question, are co-working spaces against the Google My Business guidelines? And if you are staffing and signing them appropriately, they're not against the guidelines. However, this is one of those things where you're not necessarily helping yourself either by using a co-working space. So I recommend anyone who actually wants to show up in local search and rank well in local search does not use a co-working space.
Well, I think that even if you are following all the rules, the fact that you share an address with a known co-working space raises all kinds of red flags at Google, whether it's programmatic or not, and you're going to keep dealing with getting suspended, having to prove you're real, getting reinstated. Like I argued at Local U, like you said, why spend all this money fighting that? Just go get an office.
Right. Especially if you have a persistent competitor who's willing to just keep knocking you back down.
Yep.
Then Dr. Pete, and this is about 6 days old, this article, so things have changed since then, but he did a Moz data dump and looked at the loss of review stars in the SERPs. And he's got a lot of really good data in here and some graphs, and he shows that real estate and finance probably suffered the most early on. But there has been a lot of talk of more and more suspensions since then. So this is
suspension isn't the right word. I mean, there's no penalties involved here. There's no indication that Google isn't reading the reviews or the local schema, right? One presumes they still are. The only thing that's happened is they're no longer showing the stars in search. So there's nothing that we know that's negative about this other than Google making the decision, the self-serving decision to not show stars because before they had rules and they never enforced them, because before they created the problem and didn't solve it, because who knows why, but whatever reason they've chosen not to show the stars. But I think it's important that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that's local business schema and review schema, because I think it helps Google understand. There's no reason to believe they're still reading that stuff. I think what's going to happen is the people that are cheating are not going to use it anymore. Fine. So the people that are still using it are going to be better understood by Google.
Right. I agree. Don't take it off just because stars.
Right. And we mentioned last week an article by Mike and Aaron at Gather Up that kind of explains the value of still getting these first party reviews on your site. It goes way beyond whether they show up in the SERPs or not.
Yeah, and it relates back to this article on Maps. If Maps becomes a bigger percentage of your search, there are only two things in Maps: Google information and a link to your website. That's it, right? And on your website, then you need to be concerned about how much you can convert, how much you can close, and whether your site's ranking for long tail terms in Google Maps, all that sort of stuff, all of which are best served by first party reviews. So
I just thought of that's a way to phase out that Barnacle SEO piece, right? That
yeah.
brand.
Yes. So
score
for a
thing.
long time, it looked to me like Google was touting third-party reviews so they wouldn't have to be responsible for the vetting of those reviews. Because some sites do a good job of vetting reviews. Google does not. So I kind of wonder why they're giving up that advantage by not showing third-party reviews.
In maps, yeah, I don't know. That'd be interesting to see if, as we see this transition, whether they will bring them into Google Maps or not. At this point, they're not there.
Right. Then Marie Haynes Consulting, they did a nice article where they showed some case studies how disavowing links works and different scenarios. And they even saw some value in disavowing links for websites that did not get any manual actions. If you are into disavowing links or even just want to know more about disavowing links, I view Marie Haynes as the top expert on that these days, the top expert that's willing to share information, I should say. And, in my opinion, most of us have no business disavowing links. Even if I got a manual action on a client, I would probably send it off to someone else to solve the problem because these
someone else named Marie.
Yeah, someone else named Marie. Because there are a lot of tools out there that are telling people they have toxic links. And, you really need somebody that knows what the heck is going on to look at those links before you can really say, yeah, that's something that should be disavowed, or that's just something that I should ignore and move on.
Can I put my rant in here about tools?
Certainly.
Of course.
So Google does some manual penalty. Everybody studies it, writes it up, then develops a theory about what causes it. That theory then becomes potentially the basis for a tool. And by the time, and then the tool becomes the gospel of the tool and the marketing language of the tool. And by the time a user gets around to using that tool, that information is woefully out of date, but it's still being pushed as sort of gospel, even though it hasn't kept up with the marketplace. And I think this is true with ranking tools. It's true with citation tools.
Yes.
It's true with a lot of tools where the logic of the tool was founded 10 years ago and no longer applies. And so this goes back to a point you're making that these are just broad reference points, proxies of proxies that really can't be used as gospel and need the guiding hand of an expert, or as Darren demonstrated at Moz and in a new case study I'll be showing for the first time at Duct Tape next month, citations no longer have the role that they did. And so it's important that you realize that you should be testing this stuff yourself, not relying on some tool that was built based on logic from 10 years ago.
And a tool just reports data. They don't interpret it. They don't analyze it. So
it reports data best on a model, though, that may or may not be accurate.
Sure, absolutely.
You're right.
Well, but some of them do try to analyze it for you and say this is a toxic link. And that's where I think the problem is.
Right. And so I think any report you get from a tool like this, no matter what, if you're going to use it as a trigger for you to go check something out. Don't use it as a trigger to do something, because you have to verify that it's actually a problem. Just because some tool says it's a problem doesn't mean it's really a problem.
Right. Your best tool is your brain, an experienced SEO brain. And then lastly, at Search Engine Land, Greg Sterling explains how Nextdoor is trying to make more revenue, probably because they're thinking about an IPO, and that one of the ways they're doing this is by teaming up with other local directories. And most of these other local directories are trying to make a buck off of lead gen. And they don't have that community connectivity that Nextdoor has. So it's interesting. If Nextdoor is available to you, I would definitely try using it and use Greg Sterling's ideas from this article.
What I think is interesting about Nextdoor is it has the community. I just wonder, in my experience with Facebook groups community and marketing through that, and getting business for a company through that, it's it's okay to show an ad in there, but really the brand ambassador and the recommendation from a peer on those platforms seems to carry so much more weight than any kind of sponsored content post, fill out this form, here's a thing, do you need a painter kind of stuff. It'd be interesting to see if this actually does anything. I'm not a fan of these lead gen platforms in the trade space. My husband's a painter. He gets calls from them all the time. They want to sell him leads, but they don't want to tell him what he's buying. He won't buy them because they can't even tell you where they're at. They've tried to sell him Denver leads. Denver's 3 hours from here. Like, I'm sorry, but no. So we'll see what happens with it, but I'm skeptical.
All right. What else have you got, Carrie?
So Casey Mraz wrote an article over at Juris Digital, speaking of lead gen, which I think is a really cool exploration of kind of the good and bad of hiring a lead gen company. In his case, it was for a personal injury lawyer. And he's got, what I really liked about the article is he's got a really good kind of checklist for any kind of lead gen situation. I think in any niche, not just lawyers or attorneys, that I think is a really good, is it worth it for my business to do this? Here's a checklist of things you need to consider and look at. So I really highly recommend that article if you're interested at all in lead gen. Mike wrote an article at Gather Up about Yelp's actual impact in the real world. We've kind of been referring to this a little bit throughout this last week in local about how, Yelp is really kind of dropping off the map or staying very stagnant, whereas searches are on Google and Google Maps has passed Yelp completely. So instead of people searching for the word Yelp, they're actually searching for restaurants near me. Well, they're not doing a restaurants near me query in Yelp, they're doing that in Google. And like my favorite part of the article is a quote that Mike had at the end. It's no secret, I am not a fan of Yelp, where he says they have a storied history and have shown staying power, but being the last person standing in the current context leaves them as a niche player with only a minor ability to impact your business. I think that kind of wraps up Yelp in a nutshell, in my opinion. Unless you are in a very specific market, in a very specific niche, I don't think there's a lot of value there. And I think that, what the research Mike did that he outlines in the article kind of shows that.
Right. And I think that the point you make is that local is hyper local, and you need to be aware in your local market. For example, DC restaurants my research would indicate DC is still a very Yelp-driven town, as is Austin, as is San Francisco, but that most places in the country that's not true. And the idea behind the article was to move away from the hate of Yelp into a just more rational sort of view of them, so you could put them in their little box and leave them there. They have a tendency to, their bark is much worse than their bite. They have much more presence in our sort of thinking than they deserve. They deserve to be viewed as a niche site. End of story.
Well, and I think that their popularity is waning. Look at your daughter's experience. Like, she's no longer, she was a pretty heavy Yelp user. She doesn't even open the app anymore. Like, it's not in her lexicon, and she's a millennial, right? So, I mean, that's their that was their bread and butter for so many years, and I think that use is going away. And you're right. I think part of the problem as marketers is we get harassed by Yelp a lot. So I think that's why they stay in the front of our mind. Maybe that's their point, by harassing us constantly. But I guess no press is bad press. Maybe that's their whatever. I read a really cool article on Bloomberg about a meat market, a butcher shop in Stone Ridge, New York. He's placed vending machines in front of his store that sell meat, steak, beef, pork, lamb, sausages, whatever, 24/7. And so he says that it's really popular with the people in town. He realizes that we're not in the 50s anymore. Nobody really works 9 to 5 and eats at the same time every night. Some people do their grocery shopping at 9, 10 o'clock at night because that's when they like to go or when they can go. And so by making his butcher shop selections available anytime, he's really expanded his business. He's getting ready to open up more vending machines at more of his locations throughout kind of that New York. I think it's on Long Island. I'm not sure. Ulster County. I'm not sure of the geography there, but I thought it was an interesting idea where he's not necessarily going into the online space because that's shipping and freezing and that kind of becomes a little iffy. But he's not solely relying on his brick and mortar to support his business. He's figured out a way to create income in hours when he's not available in the store. So I think that's an interesting use case.
Right. As Aaron refers to this, we're in the Amazon economy where the expectation of delivery is frequently instant, and this sort of services that customer need to be able to deliver his primary products when they want it rather than when he's able to deliver it. I think it's a very smart move, and I think it goes back to this conversation we've had about experience, but it's a way of taking the basics of delivery and leveraging those creatively to provide a bigger window for your customers' convenience.
How many people who live near him, like I said, I'm not really familiar with the geography, but maybe they commute from the city every day. They're not going to get home in time to make it to the butcher shop on most days. So how do you serve those people without shipping or delivering? This is a way to do it. Low overhead for him. I mean, all he has to do is fill the machine, right?
And then the next question is, how does he spam Google Maps so he can have his machine show up everywhere?
It's a kiosk.
It's an ATM.
It's eligible. It's a kiosk.
Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is.
Our friend Jason Brown of Review Fraud did a ride along with somebody, Vicky Gwen of the Today Show's third hour show, to kind of point out how rampant Google Maps spam is, and they drove around to a few locations they found in LA for a fake carpet cleaning company, and one was an apartment that had like a neurologist, a garage door company, and a couple other businesses all in the same apartment, which I thought was interesting.
That's what's known as incestuous.
Yes. What was interesting to me was how surprised the people in the Today Show, what do they call it, studio, were about how prevalent this is. And they made a couple comments that I thought were interesting. One was that she said after they reported those two listings to Google, they took them down. Well, of course they did, because Google won't proactively do anything about it. They're waiting for us to do their job for them. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is Dylan Dreyer, one of the hosts, says, "Wow, their map spam team must be huge." I wanted to say, no, it's not, because they don't care about this stuff. I just thought it was quite interesting how the general public sort of thinks that Google really cares, when in all actuality, like we've discussed in the past, it's an edge case for them, very small percentage, and they don't spend a lot of time on it, which is kind of sad.
Very sad, and I agree.
And then, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to see if you had any more
One
stories.
more thing. Forever 21 filed for bankruptcy. They said they're not disappearing, but they're using it as an opportunity to right-size their company. I thought that was interesting way to not use the word downsize, because that's negative. And that they need to decrease their debt load, which was somewhere between 1 and 10 billion. I think it's interesting they can't give a number. There's a lot of billions in between there. Do you not know what that number is? And Forever 21 is very dependent on malls, and we know that malls are kind of a thing of the past. People don't go to the mall like they used to. So it's interesting. They're going to close a bunch of stores. Lots of people lose their job. I have a feeling they're going to try and pump up their online presence a bit, tout that a little bit more. But it's just another in a long line of businesses that are moving from the brick and mortar economy to a different model to stay afloat. And that's it. I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for Last Week in Local. We hope to see you next week. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to send them our way. Otherwise, we look forward to having you join us again next week. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.